December 7, 1941, 7:55 a.m., Pearl Harbor. If the next 15 minutes unfold as planned, the United States will lose its Pacific Fleet at anchor, blind and burning before it can understand what is happening. If they fail, the war Japan is about to start will be short and unwinnable. There will be no second chance. The aircraft are already descending out of the sun. The harbor is quiet. Most of the men below are still half awake. In the first seconds, no one reaches for a weapon. By the time the alarms begin, it will already be too late to stop what is coming. The first torpedoes hit before the idea of an attack has fully formed. Water erupts against battleship hulls that were never supposed to be vulnerable in shallow harbor. The shock travels through steel decks and into sleeping compartments. Men are thrown from bunks without knowing why. Power fails instantly in some sections. In others, lights stay on just long enough to reveal flooding rushing inward. There is no declaration, no warning, no moment of adjustment. The attack arrives fully formed. Pilots fly so low they can see faces on the decks. Bombs fall in controlled arcs, aimed not at buildings, but at ships that cannot maneuver. Anti-aircraft guns exist, but ammunition is locked. Orders are unclear. Officers are missing. The chain of command hesitates for seconds that cannot be recovered. The harbor becomes noise without direction. Explosions overlap. Smoke rises and traps sound beneath it. The water ignites where fuel spreads across the surface. Men jump overboard into oil and fire because staying aboard feels worse. Some will drown anyway, weighed down by boots, disoriented in darkness created by smoke and debris. The USS Arizona is struck and disappears in a single detonation that kills more than 1,000 men almost instantly. There is no time to understand it. The shockwave flattens those nearby. Burning metal rains down on decks already under attack. For those who witness it, the war does not begin gradually. It begins fully, violently, and without explanation. In these first minutes, there is no strategy on the American side, only reaction. Guns are fired at shadows. Orders contradict each other. Damage control teams form without instruction because that is what sailors do when ships are dying. The instinct to save the ship overrides fear, even as it becomes clear that some ships cannot be saved. Japanese pilots follow their checklists precisely. Targets are identified. Attack runs are clean and disciplined. This is not chaos from their perspective. It is execution. They know exactly how long they have before surprise decays and resistance organizes. Every second matters. Every missed opportunity compounds. By the time the first 15 minutes end, the shape of the war has already changed. Battleships are sunk or sinking. Airfields are burning. Aircraft meant to defend the Pacific lie destroyed on the ground. The fleet is crippled without having fired back in any meaningful way. What happens next will take years to resolve. But the outcome is already locked in motion. The war that was supposed to be delayed has been accelerated. The nation that was meant to be shocked into retreat has instead been forced into something it cannot stop once it begins. Those first 15 minutes do not decide who will win. They decide that the war will be total. What follows those first minutes is not clarity, but confusion layered on top of damage. Men run toward fires without knowing whether the ships they are trying to save can still float. Officers give orders that cannot be carried out because the equipment they rely on no longer exists. Ammunition finally reaches some guns, but targets are already moving away or hidden by smoke. The sky is full, yet empty at the same time. The harbor has become a trap. Ships are packed close together, unable to maneuver, their crews exposed. Damage control parties work by feel as much as sight, sealing compartments that are already flooding, cutting through bulkheads to free men they cannot see. The waterline rises silently in places where no explosion was heard, the result of holes punched below the surface minutes earlier. On Ford Island and the surrounding airfields, aircraft burn in neat rows. They were parked wingtip to wingtip to prevent sabotage, not air attack. Now that same precaution turns them into kindling. Pilots reach planes only to find them already on fire or riddled with shrapnel. Some manage to get airborne in damaged fighters, climbing into a sky where the attack has already passed them by. The second wave arrives with less surprise but no less effect. Resistance has begun to form, but it is uneven, improvised. Some guns find their range. A few Japanese aircraft are hit. It does not change the pattern. Bombs continue to fall where ships cannot move and where men cannot escape. Fires spread unchecked, fed by fuel lines and ruptured tanks. Inside sinking battleships, time collapses. Compartments fill faster than men can retreat. Corridors become vertical shafts of water. Orders to abandon ship come too late for some, too early for others. Those who make it out cling to debris or swim through oil that coats their skin and blinds their eyes. The smell of burning fuel mixes with salt and smoke until it becomes impossible to separate one from the other. There is no single command center coordinating a response. Communications are fragmented. Messages contradict what men can see in front of them. The attack has stripped away the assumption that someone, somewhere, understands the whole picture. No one does. Everyone is acting on partial information, and the partial information is already outdated. Japanese pilots begin to withdraw. Fuel levels dictate the end of the mission more than resistance does. They have achieved what they came for, even if not everything went according to plan. Some ships are still afloat. Some targets remain untouched. But the essential damage is done. Surprise has been spent, and staying longer only increases risk. As the last aircraft disappear, the harbor does not quiet. Fires continue to burn. Ammunition cooks off. Ships list and settle into the mud. Men keep working because stopping would mean looking directly at what has happened. Rescue efforts begin immediately, but they are overwhelmed by scale. For hours, trapped sailors are heard knocking from inside hulls that cannot be cut open fast enough. By mid-morning, the outlines of the disaster become visible. Battleships lie capsized or sunk at their moorings. The water is covered with wreckage. The air smells of smoke and oil. Casualty lists begin to form, already incomplete. The attack is over, but its effects are only beginning to register. What makes those first 15 minutes decisive is not just the destruction they cause, but the assumptions they erase. The idea that distance provides safety, the idea that war will arrive with warning, the idea that preparation alone is enough. All of that is gone before the sun is fully up. The United States has not yet declared war. No speeches have been given, no plans have been rewritten, but the trajectory is fixed. The fleet will be rebuilt, the losses will be counted, the shock will harden into resolve. None of that changes what those minutes have already done. They have removed choice. They have made entry into the war unavoidable. In the hours that follow, the scale of what has happened becomes impossible to contain. Messages move out from Hawaii in fragments, incomplete and contradictory, carrying numbers that do not yet add up. Commanders try to impose order on scenes that refuse it. Ships that were supposed to be written off are found still afloat. Others that looked stable suddenly roll or sink as fires weaken internal structure. Nothing settles cleanly. Men are pulled from the water long after they should have been dead. Others are not found at all. Rescue teams cut into hulls where tapping is still heard, racing against time they cannot see. In some compartments, oxygen is already gone. In others, men wait in darkness, listening to metal being cut closer and then farther away. Some will survive because someone chose the right spot. Others will not because the choice came seconds too late. Across the Pacific, the Japanese strike force turns for home. Radio silence is maintained. There is no celebration on deck. Pilots know they have done damage, but not how much. They do not know which ships are sunk beyond recovery and which will be raised and returned to service. They do not know that the aircraft carriers they failed to find will matter far more than the battleships they destroyed. That calculation will only become clear much later. In Washington, the first reports arrive stripped of context. Air attack on Pearl Harbor. Heavy losses. This is not a drill. There is no debate about interpretation. The question is not whether this means war, but how quickly the machinery of war can be set in motion. What was once hypothetical is now operational reality. For the men at Pearl Harbor, time stretches and compresses at the same moment. Some work without stopping for days. Others sit in stunned silence once their tasks are done, unable to reconcile the calm sky with the wreckage below it. The harbor looks unnatural, its familiar outline broken by ships that now sit at angles they were never meant to hold. The first 15 minutes have already done their work. They have shattered routine. They have collapsed distance. They have proven that the war will not wait for readiness or agreement. Everything that follows, mobilization, production, campaigns across oceans, unfolds because those minutes removed any alternative. Years later, the attack will be reduced to images and dates. Burning ships, rising smoke, a single morning frozen in memory. What is often missed is how quickly it all happened, how little time there was to adapt, how decisively the trajectory shifted before anyone could intervene. Those 15 minutes did not destroy the United States Navy. They did something more lasting. They ensured that the war would be fought to its end without hesitation and without compromise. By the time the fires are finally brought under control, the outcome is no longer in question. The cost will be immense, the path will be brutal, but the direction is fixed. The war did not begin at Pearl Harbor, but in those first 15 minutes it became inescapable. What remains after the smoke begins to thin is not understanding, but inevitability. The damage cannot be undone, the losses cannot be reframed. Whatever hesitation existed before that morning no longer has a place to stand. The country has been struck in a way that removes delay as an option. The battleships can be raised. Many of them will be. The harbor will be cleared, the airfields rebuilt, the fleet reorganized around carriers that were not present that morning. But none of that alters the psychological rupture that occurs in those first minutes. The belief that war could be managed at a distance is gone. The idea that timing could be controlled is gone. The assumption that preparation alone ensures security is gone. What the attack exposes is vulnerability, but not weakness. It forces a consolidation of effort that would have taken years under any other circumstances. Industry will pivot, training will accelerate, strategy will harden. The United States does not enter the war cautiously after Pearl Harbor. It enters without ambiguity. For the men who survived the morning, the memory does not align with later explanations. They remember confusion before anger, helplessness before resolve, the sound of explosions before the idea of a nation at war. Many of them will fight again across the Pacific, carrying with them the knowledge of what happens when readiness meets surprise and fails. The Japanese planners understand they have awakened something they cannot fully measure. They have struck hard, but they have also eliminated the possibility of negotiation, delay, or limited conflict. The attack that was meant to secure advantage instead ensures duration. The war will not end quickly now. It will expand. Those first 15 minutes matter because they compress history. They take debates that might have lasted years and resolve them instantly. They turn policy into action, theory into necessity. Everything that follows, the island campaigns, the carrier battles, the grinding advance across the Pacific, flows outward from that moment. When people later ask where the war truly began for the United States, the answer is not found in declarations or speeches. It is found in a harbor just before 8 in the morning, when routine was shattered so completely that nothing familiar survived intact. In that brief window, before alarms fully sounded and before orders fully formed, the course of the war locked into place, not because of what was destroyed, but because of what could no longer be avoided. Those first 15 minutes did not end anything. They removed every other beginning. After that morning, nothing moved at the pace it once had. Decisions that had lingered in committees for years were made in days. Ships still under construction were reassigned before keels cooled. Men who had expected months of preparation found themselves rushed through training, pushed forward by a sense that time itself had become hostile. Pearl Harbor became a place of work rather than mourning almost immediately. Wreckage was cut away. Hulls were patched. The harbor floor was mapped not for navigation, but for recovery. Every effort was directed forward because looking back offered no utility. The attack had not asked permission. The response would not wait for reflection. What those first 15 minutes ultimately removed was the illusion of control. Not control over outcome, but control over tempo. The war would now dictate speed, escalation, and cost. Every subsequent decision would be made under the shadow of that loss of initiative. From then on, reacting too slowly would feel like repeating the same mistake. For the men who had watched the sky fill with aircraft that morning, the sound of engines would never again be neutral. For the officers who had struggled to issue orders amid confusion, surprise would become the enemy they planned against above all others. Pearl Harbor recalibrated instinct as much as strategy. The harbor itself would recover, but the moment would not. It would sit at the beginning of every campaign that followed, an unspoken reference point. The knowledge that the war could arrive fully formed, without transition, without warning, and without mercy. Those 15 minutes did not just mark an attack. They marked the end of hesitation as a national condition. From that point forward, the war would be fought not to contain damage, but to prevent its repetition. And everything that followed, every ship launched, every island taken, every mile crossed, carried the weight of a single morning when time ran out before anyone knew it had begun to count. Years later, when the war is studied in retrospect, it becomes tempting to search for balance in those first moments, to measure what was lost against what was preserved, to note that the aircraft carriers were absent, that fuel tanks survived, that the blow, however severe, was not fatal. Those observations are accurate. They are also beside the point. What mattered in those first 15 minutes was not what survived, but what vanished permanently. The option to stay out, the belief that events could be shaped slowly, the confidence that war would announce itself before demanding response. All of that disappeared before the smoke fully rose. For the men on the decks that morning, there was no sense of history unfolding, only the immediacy of steel tearing open, of heat where there should not have been heat, of water rising where it should not have risen. The understanding came later, after the fires were out, and the dead were counted, that they had been present at the moment when inevitability replaced choice. Pearl Harbor would become a name spoken with clarity, a date remembered exactly, but the reality of it lived in a narrower space, in minutes measured by the fall of torpedoes and the collapse of routine, in seconds where reaction lagged behind impact, in the realization that by the time understanding arrived, consequences were already irreversible. Those 15 minutes did not require explanation. They enforced one. They forced a war that would stretch across oceans and years. They ensured that compromise would no longer be possible. They set in motion a conflict that would end only with unconditional outcomes on both sides. Not because of anger alone, but because delay had been proven fatal. Pearl Harbor did not decide how the war would be fought. It decided that it would be fought to the end, and that decision was made before most of the men below decks had time to reach the surface. What followed, inevitably, was momentum that could not be slowed. Once the shock hardened into resolve, there was no mechanism left for restraint. The country did not drift into war. It surged. Production schedules were rewritten overnight. Civilian industries were converted with a speed that surprised even those directing it. The scale of response was not measured. It was absolute. For the men who survived Pearl Harbor, the memory never aligned with the scale of what came after. They remembered the morning as fragmented and intimate, a specific ladder, a specific compartment, a specific sound that meant something had gone wrong before it could be named. Later campaigns would be larger, bloodier, and more decisive, but none would feel as sudden. That is the paradox of those first 15 minutes. They are remembered as an opening blow, yet they contained the entire logic of the war to come. Surprise would be hunted relentlessly. Distance would no longer be trusted. Preparation would be accelerated to the point of exhaustion. The conflict that followed was shaped as much by what was felt that morning as by what was destroyed. The Japanese planners had hoped to buy time, to shock the United States into negotiation or delay. Instead, they compressed everything. The attack eliminated the slow paths history sometimes takes and forced the fastest one available. In doing so, it ensured that whatever advantage was gained tactically would be overwhelmed strategically. Pearl Harbor became a fixed point. Every later decision referenced it implicitly. Every failure to anticipate was judged against it. Every plan assumed that surprise, if allowed, would be catastrophic. The memory of those minutes was not commemorated quietly. It was operationalized. When the war finally ended, years later, and half a world away, the path back could still be traced to that harbor and that morning. Not because it was the worst destruction, but because it was the moment when uncertainty vanished, when the future stopped branching and collapsed into a single direction. The fires were extinguished, the ships were raised, the harbor returned to function. But the moment itself was never repaired. It remained intact in memory because it marked the instant when history accelerated beyond recall. The first 15 minutes at Pearl Harbor did not explain the war that followed. They made explanation unnecessary. From that point on, everything moved forward because it had to. What is often forgotten is how quickly normality tried to reassert itself even as the damage was still burning. Men were reassigned before they had processed what they had seen. Paperwork resumed while bodies were still being recovered. Orders went out not to dwell, not to speculate, not to pause. The war had begun, and the machinery that would carry it forward did not allow for reflection. Pearl Harbor became a place of instruction. Every failure cataloged, every delay analyzed, locks changed, ammunition protocols rewritten, aircraft dispersed, radar procedures tightened. The attack did not just destroy, it rewired behavior. Surprise was no longer abstract. It was personal, measurable, and unacceptable. For those who had lived through the first minutes, this transition felt abrupt and incomplete. There was no clean boundary between attack and aftermath. The smell of oil lingered for weeks. The sight of capsized hulls became routine. Men learned to work around wreckage as if it had always been there, stepping over the remains of ships that had been whole only hours earlier. The memory of helplessness during those first moments never fully faded. It surfaced later in hesitation before issuing orders, in overcorrections, in the determination to never again be caught without immediate response. Pearl Harbor did not just motivate, it disciplined. It narrowed acceptable margins to almost nothing. In that sense, the first 15 minutes continued long after the last aircraft had gone. They echoed through every convoy assembled, every island assaulted, every decision to press forward rather than wait. The war in the Pacific would be defined by speed, initiative, and refusal to yield time, because time, once lost, had proven irreversible. The harbor that morning did not teach victory, it taught urgency. And urgency, once learned that way, does not loosen its grip. Long after the wreckage was cleared and the ships returned to service or scrap, the moment remained intact in memory. Not as a single explosion or image, but as the realization that the war would not be negotiated, postponed, or contained. It would be fought through to its conclusion, wherever that led. Those first 15 minutes did not just open a war. They closed the door on every other possibility. And because that door closed so completely, there was no space left for doubt afterward. The shock of Pearl Harbor did not fade into anger and then resolve. It fused them together. The country did not ask how to respond. It asked how fast. The question of scale was answered by the damage itself. Anything less than total commitment now felt like repetition of the same mistake. In the Pacific, commanders began planning not for containment, but for endurance. Long distances, long supply lines, long campaigns measured in attrition rather than decisive blows. The first 15 minutes had demonstrated what happened when readiness lagged behind intent. From that point forward, intent would never again wait for readiness. Readiness would be forced to catch up. For the sailors who survived, the war never really began anywhere else. Every later battle carried echoes of that morning. The sound of aircraft engines overhead, the instinct to look up first, the understanding that vulnerability arrives before explanation. Pearl Harbor was not just remembered, it was carried. The harbor itself eventually returned to order. The water cleared, the wreckage thinned. Ships once written off sailed again. Visitors would later stand on decks rebuilt over the remains of those who never escaped. The physical damage was repaired. The psychological boundary was not. Because what Pearl Harbor ultimately destroyed in those first 15 minutes was the illusion that wars begin slowly, that there is time to understand before acting, that preparation can be perfected before it is tested. None of that survived the opening moments of the attack. The war that followed would be larger than anything imagined that morning. It would end cities, reshape borders, and exhaust nations. But its character, its speed, its refusal to pause, its demand for total commitment was set before 8 o'clock, while smoke was still rising and men were still trapped below decks. Those 15 minutes did not decide the outcome of the war. They decided its nature. From that moment on, the United States would not ease into conflict or step back from it. The path forward was locked, not by policy or ideology, but by the simple fact that time had already run out. And once that happened, there was no turning back. What came next was not rage in the abstract, but focus. The kind that strips away alternatives and leaves only execution. Pearl Harbor did not create a desire for revenge as much as it created a tolerance for cost. Loss had arrived without warning, and so loss in return no longer felt hypothetical. The nation adjusted to that reality with speed that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. In the Pacific, every plan assumed the worst case. Every delay was treated as dangerous. Every opportunity to seize initiative was taken even when incomplete, even when risky. The memory of those first minutes hovered over decisions that would send men across beaches and into jungles years later. Surprise would be hunted. Tempo would be enforced. Waiting would be treated as weakness. For those who had been at Pearl Harbor, the war never acquired a clean narrative arc. There was no before that felt stable enough to contrast with what came after. The morning erased that distinction. It compressed peace and war into the same space, making the transition irreversible. Some would later say the attack unified the country. What it really did was eliminate hesitation. That is why the first 15 minutes matter more than the damage assessed afterward. Not because they were uniquely violent, but because they were decisive in a way no later battle could be. They did not answer a question. They removed it. When historians look for the moment the United States committed fully to World War II, they often point to speeches, votes, and declarations. Those came later. The commitment was made earlier, in a harbor where men were still running to their stations while ships were already dying. In those minutes, the war stopped being something that might happen and became something that had to be finished. The difference is everything. Pearl Harbor did not give the United States time to decide what kind of war it wanted to fight. It decided that there would be no choice at all. And that decision was locked in before the first fires were put out, before the dead were counted, and before the country had time to understand what it had just become part of. What followed in the days immediately after was an attempt to regain control of something that no longer moved at human speed. Intelligence assessments were rewritten as quickly as they were proven incomplete. Patrols went out expecting a second strike that never came. The absence of another attack felt almost unnatural, as if the war had inhaled and then chosen to wait. That waiting was deceptive. It was not calm. It was recalibration. Every assumption that had shaped American planning in the Pacific was now suspect. Battleships were no longer the center of gravity. Fixed defenses were no longer reassurance. Distance was no longer insulation. The first 15 minutes had not just destroyed ships. They had invalidated an entire way of thinking about war. For the men on Oahu, the sense of vulnerability lingered. The sky was watched constantly. Engines overhead triggered instinctive reactions. Anti-aircraft crews stayed at their stations long after exhaustion set in, because stepping away felt irresponsible. The attack had taught a brutal lesson. The moment you relax is the moment you are struck. On the Japanese side, the strike was already being analyzed with quiet urgency. Reports were compiled. Losses were counted. Questions were asked about what had not been found, what had not been destroyed, what had been left untouched. The success was real but incomplete, and incompleteness, once recognized, has consequences. The first 15 minutes had given Japan tactical shock. They had not given Japan strategic closure. That imbalance would widen over time. The United States did not recover evenly. It overcorrected. Shipbuilding expanded beyond any pre-war projection. Training pipelines widened until they strained. Doctrine shifted under pressure, favoring aggression and initiative at the expense of caution. The attack had taught that caution bought nothing when the enemy moved first. Every island campaign that followed carried this imprint: the refusal to wait, the willingness to accept losses in exchange for momentum. The belief that initiative, once seized, must never be surrendered. These traits did not emerge slowly. They were born in those first minutes, when delay proved catastrophic. Pearl Harbor became the unspoken reference point for everything that followed, not as a rallying cry, but as a warning, a reminder of what happens when readiness lags behind intent. A reminder that the cost of being unprepared is paid immediately and without negotiation. The harbor itself would eventually look normal again. Ships would come and go. Flags would fly. Ceremonies would be held. But the memory of those first 15 minutes never softened into symbolism for those who lived through them. It remained raw, specific, and instructional. They remembered how fast it happened, how little time there was to think, how quickly the world changed, and that memory shaped a war that would not end until the other side could no longer act at all. As the weeks passed, the shock settled into routine, but it never softened. Pearl Harbor became a fixed reference point, not as a symbol, but as a condition. Every planning meeting, every movement order, every calculation of risk carried an unspoken assumption: if you wait, you lose. The memory of those first minutes did not fade into history. It hardened into instinct. Men who had never seen combat before Pearl Harbor would soon fight with an urgency shaped by a morning they had not witnessed. Training emphasized speed over perfection, initiative over certainty. The lesson had been learned the hard way. The enemy would not pause to let understanding catch up. From that point on, hesitation felt dangerous in itself. For those who were there, the attack never resolved into a single image. It remained fragmented. A ladder slick with oil, a hatch that would not open, a gun that finally fired when the sky was already empty. The scale of the war that followed never erased those details. If anything, it made them heavier, because everything that came after seemed to trace back to them. Pearl Harbor did not just change strategy, it changed expectations. Loss became acceptable in advance. Surprise became the primary threat, and the idea of limited war vanished completely. Once the fleet burned at anchor, there was no room left for gradualism. The conflict that followed would be fought to remove the enemy's ability to act, not to influence behavior. The irony is that the harbor itself survived. It was repaired, reinforced, and returned to function. The ships that could be raised were raised. The base became stronger than it had been before, but the moment that defined it remained frozen, untouched by reconstruction. It existed outside repair. Because what those first 15 minutes truly destroyed was the future as it had been imagined before them. The war could no longer be delayed, shaped, or contained by preference. It would be driven by momentum until one side could no longer sustain it. Everything else, the campaigns, the casualties, the victories, would follow from that. Not because Pearl Harbor decided them directly, but because it decided how the war would be fought. And that decision was made before most of the men under those decks ever heard an order. By the time the meaning of those first 15 minutes is fully understood, it is already too late to change anything they set in motion. The ships lie where they fell. The dead are counted. The damage is catalogued. But the deeper consequence is invisible and irreversible. A line has been crossed without ceremony, and there is no mechanism for stepping back over it. What remains in this moment before the war fully unfolds is a narrowing of possibilities. Negotiation is gone. Delay is gone. Containment is gone. The attack has compressed every future decision into a single direction, forcing action not because it is chosen, but because it is now unavoidable. The men who were there feel this before anyone else. They sense that the morning is not an isolated event, but an opening that cannot be closed. The harbor is still burning, rescue is still underway, and already the future has been stripped of alternatives. Whatever comes next will come at full scale. This is the last quiet boundary. The final moment before consequence expands outward across oceans and years. The point where shock hardens into inevitability, and the war, no longer theoretical, prepares to consume everything in front of it. When the fires finally die down and the harbor settles into a scarred stillness, nothing has been resolved. The damage is visible. The loss is measurable. But the true effect of those first 15 minutes cannot be repaired or reversed. They did not destroy the fleet. They destroyed hesitation. From that moment forward, the war will not pause, negotiate, or slow. It will expand until one side is incapable of continuing. Every ship launched, every island assaulted, every mile crossed will trace back to a single morning when time ran out before understanding could catch up. Pearl Harbor does not stand as the beginning of the war. It stands as the moment when the war became inevitable, and that decision was made in silence, between explosions, before the country had time to choose anything else.